This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So I'm going to talk about loyalty to my teachers, but I'm just going to reiterate the 4 acceptance verses or ordination vows. So they go like this. With loyalty to my teachers, I accept this ordination. In harmony with friends and companions, I accept this ordination. For the attainment of enlightenment, I accept this ordination. For the benefit of all beings, I accept this ordination. And as Maitreya Bhaddi said, these 4 acceptance verses, sometimes they're called ordination vows, which just sort of underlines the seriousness of them. And I don't think they're just serious, I think they're very beautiful as well. I think the expression of them is very poetic and very beautiful. And I think what they actually really represent is and I think Bhante said this himself, they represent the spirit in which ordination is given and in which it is received. The spirit in which ordination is given and in which it is received. So they really encapsulate the spirit of what it means to be a Dharmachari or a Dharmacharini. So they're very, very important. And I think one shouldn't just study them, one should memorize them and really take them to heart and reflect on them and then try to live by them, and try to live deeply by them. And I think one of the things you notice is that 3 out of 4 of the ordination acceptance verses or vows, they're to do with other people. They're to do with being in relationship with other people. So one's in relationship with one's teacher, one's in relationship, or teachers, one's in relationship with one's companions in the spiritual life, and one's in relationship with all beings by doing what you can basically to help others. And I think you could actually see these ordination vows as representing different aspects of positive emotion. So with loyalty to my teachers, I think that represents the development of gratitude and reverence. In harmony with friends and brethren represents the development of metta. And for the benefit of all beings, doing what you can to help others represents the development of compassion. There's more I could say about that. It ties in very neatly with the Tara practice, but I won't go into that. So with loyalty to my teachers, I accept this ordination. And that's the first of the ordination vows or acceptance verses. And it's significant that it comes first because it's very, very difficult, I'd say almost impossible for most people to make progress without a spiritual teacher. And I believe in India it's thought to be a great misfortune not to have a spiritual teacher. You need someone who can guide you from a higher perspective. You can't sort it out on your own. You can't sort it out through reading books. You need actual living contact with a spiritual teacher. And Atisha actually brings this out in the precepts of the gurus, and he says that something along the lines that the precept of the Lama is worth more than all the teachings and the commentaries. And that's because you have a personal relationship with your teacher, and he can actually draw on his experience of the Dharma, and he can draw out that aspect of the Dharma that is actually particularly relevant to you at this particular time in your spiritual development. So in a way it's a sort of spiritual advice, but it's from a whole wealth of experience and understanding of the Dharma. So the precept of the Guru is more important than all the teachings, all the scriptures and commentaries. So I want to start with a story, and it's probably a story that's well known to you, and it's the story of Yasha. And Yasha was a sort of playboy. He was a wealthy merchant's son, and he was partying in Benares with his courtesans, and in the midst of the revelries he fell asleep, and he woke up in the middle of the night, and it was like the emptiness of his life just really struck him, the sort of the hollowness of his life struck him. And he looked around, he saw the courtesans, and they were all asleep, and they were in disarray, and one was dribbling, others were muttering in their sleep. And he was really shocked, and it was like a revelation that hit him. And he just said, this is fearful, this is horrible. And he immediately left, and he walked out through the city gates of Benares, and he walked to the deer park at Isipatana, at Sarnath. And he got there just before dawn. And the Buddha was up early, and he was walking to and fro in the deer park mindfully. And Yasha came bursting in. This is fearful, this is horrible. And the Buddha very calmly said, this is not fearful, this is not harmful. Come, sit down, Yasha, and I will teach you the Dharma. And Yasha calmed down, he sat down, and the Buddha started to communicate with him. And when he felt that Yasha was receptive, he taught him the Dharma, and his Dharma eye opened, and he became a stream entrant. And it didn't stop there, because then his father came looking for Yasha. His father met the Buddha, he also became a stream entrant, and so on and so on. And I think this is very much like ourselves. We may not experience disgust with our lives. It may not be as strong as that. But I think probably it's some sort of unsatisfactoriness that's led us to the Dharma, some sort of probably existential dukkha, a sense of limitation, a sense that, well, your life might be very good, but there must be more. And maybe that's what gets us started, and that's what brings us along to something like Triratna. And we find ourselves looking to connect. And I think this is what human beings perhaps want more than anything. They want to connect deeply and meaningfully with other human beings. And so we don't just want to connect with a teaching, we want also to connect with the teacher. So then the question is, who are our teachers? And we have many teachers, actually. We have teachers near and far, and we have teachers from the past and teachers in the present. And our first teacher is the Buddha. Everything comes from the Buddha. The Buddha is teacher of gods and men, Satadeva Manusa. He's a teacher even beyond the gods. And he had an incredible impact on people, not just by what he taught, but by his very presence. And if you're at all familiar with the Pali Canon, you probably realise it's mostly just it's just a whole series of meetings. It's just the Buddha meeting people, getting into communication with them. When they're receptive and open, he teaches them the Dharma in a way that's totally relevant to them, and then they go for refuge. And again, through the Pali Canon, we hear this refrain. Magnificent Lord, the Dharma has been made clear in many ways by the Blessed One, as though he was righting the overthrown, revealing the hidden, showing the way to one who is lost, holding up a lamp in the darkness for those with eyes to see. And then what follows is, I go to the Blessed One for refuge, to the Dharma and to the Sangha for refuge. And in the language of this language of going for refuge, to the early Buddhists, it expressed an undying allegiance to the Buddha and his teachings. And it meant renouncing and giving up other teachers, and practically it means not only taking the Buddha as your teacher, this is what going for refuge means, not only taking the Buddha as your teacher, but being loyal to his teachings, putting them into practice, and communicating and passing them on to others. So being loyal to his teachings, putting them into practice, and communicating and passing them on to others. And it's very important to be familiar with the Dharma as taught by the Buddha, especially in the Pali Suttas. I think Bhante once said that all you actually need to gain enlightenment is probably a few verses from the Dhammapada. You don't actually need very much. But they contain the basic Buddhism. And I don't mean basic beginners. I just mean, the very foundations of what we actually practice, how we actually practice the spiritual life. And these are classical teachings out of which all the other later teachings evolved. Teachings such as Praticca Samutpada, that's conditioned co-production, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Three Lakshanas, the Threefold Way. And they're important because all Buddhists accept these teachings, and without being thoroughly grounded in these teachings, you cannot really understand the later teachings which develop from them of the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. And a friend of mine was studying here on the Transcendental Principle Retreat, studying Praticca Samutpada, conditioned co-production. Everything arises from causes and conditions. When those causes and conditions cease, those things no longer arise. And everything really comes out of that teaching. And he said that studying the Transcendental Principle, it was the first time that he'd really understood the Dharma. He said it was as if Praticca Samutpada was the trunk of a tree, without which it was like trying to grab hold of disconnected branches. And without that reference to the trunk, there's just confusion. And you know that if you pick up Dharma books and you just try to, learn the Dharma from books, so random selection of books without a teacher. And there are some teachings which are particular to Triratna, which we come across again and again, and in a way they become like old friends. And I'm thinking particularly of teachings like Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, which we study on the Gokulaika course, and of course the Dhammapada and the Sutta Nipata, and also Songs of Milarepa. So it's as if within Triratna we have a core of different sutras and teachings which we come back to again and again like old friends. And there's great richness in the Dharma, and it's very diverse, but it all needs to be grounded very much in the Buddha's enlightenment experience, which comes out in those early teachings. And there's not just teachings, but we've also got the refuge tree. And you notice in the refuge tree you've got the Buddha right at the centre, and then you've got all these other teachers, as it were, radiating out from the Buddha. And all the figures on the refuge tree, all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the Arahants, the teachers of the past, the teachers of the present, they all come out of the Buddha's enlightenment experience. And that's why he's right at the centre of the refuge tree. And there are the teachers of the past, and just they're on the refuge tree because they're very, very inspiring examples of the spiritual life lived fully. We can't emulate, we can't practice all the teachings that those teachers of the past taught, but we can be inspired and emulate their example. And closer still, we have Bhante's own teachers. And Bhante had a very strong feeling for his teachers. He probably didn't actually spend very much time with them, but they were very, very present for him, and very much present in his consciousness. He didn't really feel he felt any need to go and see them. He felt in contact with them, and he felt particularly in contact with them through his dreams. And he dreamed a lot about his teachers, and I think he particularly dreamed a lot about his teachers when he was passing over the headship of the order. And that seemed very relevant because he felt as if they were blessing him in the steps that he was taking. And I think closest to us all of his teachers is, of course, Dado Rinpoche. And as you know, we've got a portion of Dado Rinpoche's ashes in the stupa in the courtyard outside the shrine room, and we'll be circumambulating that stupa in the evenings on the retreat. And in a way, we're circumambulating the Bodhisattva. We're putting the Bodhisattva in the middle, and we're walking around him and making offerings to him. And, Dado Rinpoche himself was a very devotional man, and he had great devotion for his own teacher, who was Geshe Lunduk. And so much so that when Geshe Lunduk died, Dado Rinpoche broke down. He was so upset by the death of his teacher. And I think Dado Rinpoche is also close to us because many order members and mitras actually were able to visit him in Kalimpong while he was still alive, and to write reminiscences about him. And he was also a friend to Bhante. He wasn't just a teacher to Bhante, but he found that he could, as well as being a teacher, he had this relationship of a close friendship with Bhante, which was something new to both of them and something very significant to both of them. And I don't know if you've seen this, but recently there was a video from Urgyen House. If you haven't seen it, do see it. It's where Dada Rinpoche is talking about his connection with Bhante. And he's saying that he saw a need for the teaching of the Dharma to go to the West. But he realised that he wouldn't be able to take the Dharma to the West himself because it wasn't his culture. But he could see that Bhante could do that. And he says in the interview that Bhante would be worth 20 Tibetan Lamas going to the West. And I think one of the other reasons why Dada Rinpoche is so important is because Bhante Sangharakshita took the Bodhisattva vow from Dada Rinpoche. And he took the Bodhisattva vow from Dada Rinpoche because he considered him to be the most Bodhisattva-like of all his teachers. And he said that he watched him very closely over many, many years, and in all that time he never saw him in an unskillful state of mind. That's really something. Okay, so closer still, we come to Bhante Urgyen Sangharakshita himself, our own direct teacher. And Bhante is the founder of the order, and he's also the preceptor to the order, either directly or indirectly. So you'll be ordained by somebody probably who was ordained by Bhante, or they were ordained by somebody who was ordained by Bhante, and so on. And that's the way that a lineage develops. He's our spiritual teacher. He's the teacher of the Dharma. And he's not just a teacher, or one of our teachers. He is the teacher of the order. And I think it's really important here that we view ourselves as a new tradition, that Triratna is a new tradition, and that Bhante is the founder of that tradition. And the way that he founded the order was quite traditional. He just looked around, he saw what teachings were available, he gathered together the teachings which were actually relevant to people practicing now, and he created his own Dharma, his own teaching, very traditional, but also very radical. So I think it's very important that if we're going to join the order, that we're clear that we are taking Bhante as our teacher, and that the Dharma that we're going to be practicing is the Dharma as mediated through Bhante. If we don't want Bhante as our teacher, that's fine, and there are plenty of other Buddhist traditions which work perfectly well. But if we're going to join this order, then we need to actually understand that we're taking Bhante as our teacher, and we're going to be following his teachings. So with loyalty to my teachers also means taking Bhante as the teacher of the order. And that means that the Dharma studied, practiced and taught by order members is in accordance with the spirit of the Dharma taught by Bhante. And if we're going to join the order, it's important that we're very familiar with Bhante's teachings, particularly the core teachings. And it's funny with Bhante's teachings because I think that you have to come back to them again and again. In a way, they seem very straightforward. But as you go on, and as you go on in your practice, you begin to actually see deeper and deeper levels in those teachings. And it's very important that we familiarise ourselves with Bhante's teachings as a whole, if we're going to practice them and pass them on. So of course there's going to be further developments of those teachings, but those developments need to be in accord with the teachings that have come before. And Bhante himself speaks of himself as a translator. So he's translated the Dharma from the East, and he's brought it back to the West and translated it into ways that are actually relevant and applicable to practicing Dharma at this time in the West. He's taken something up out of the depths, out of the darkness, and brought it up into the light. And he's not just a meditation teacher, he's not just a Dharma teacher. I think his achievement is setting up an order and a movement with all its institutions and the order itself, and making it possible to live a total and integrated Dharma life in the West. And I think that's quite an achievement. And not only that, but he's also passed it on to his disciples in a way that it will continue to grow and flourish after his death. And I think it's just very evident that after Bhante's death, his particular Dharma has continued to grow and flourish. And my sense of the order and the movement is it's very, very healthy. It's going from strength to strength. It's becoming more diversified, but without losing its depth. So I just think that's an incredible achievement, actually. And I think from a certain point of view, you could see the movement as a manifestation of Bhante's punya, of Bhante's merit. In a way you could see it as his Buddha field almost. It's his bodhisattva activity. The founding of the movement is Bhante's bodhisattva activity. And by helping him in his work, we're perpetuating that stream of merit. I think you need an enormous amount of merit to affect so many people as he's affected in so many different cultures across the world. And because teaching can only take place in a spirit of metta, in a spirit of friendliness, Bhante also speaks of himself as the Kalyana Mitra to the order and to the movement, or just the friend to the movement and the order. So these days, obviously very few people have a personal relationship with Bhante. I imagine some of you came along actually after Bhante's death. But I still think it's possible to have a real relationship with Bhante, and I know people who've responded very, very strongly to Bhante who've never actually met him. Some years before he died, I went to see him, and I asked him about this, and I said, look, it seems to me that some people find you a rather distant figure. They don't know quite how to connect with you. And he said, well, they can always come and see me. But then he went on to say, but they can get to know me through my writings and through my poetry and so on. And then he went on to say, but the idea of a personal relationship is just too subjective, which is the sort of thing he would say. So I said, okay, well, in that case, what is it that makes a good teacher-disciple relationship with you? How do you have a good teacher-disciple relationship with you, even if you haven't met you, even if one hasn't met you? And he said, and he seemed sort of mildly astonished, and he said, well, you practice my teachings, And really that's how we get to know Bhante. We get to know Bhante through practicing his teachings. And you could say that you get to know the Buddha through practicing his teachings. That's the only way you can get to know your teacher, I think, is through faithfully studying, practicing, and passing on their teachings. That's how you get to know what Bhante is, really. And as you go on with your spiritual practice, and if you try to do that, there'll be more and more of an affinity between yourself and your teacher or your teachers. A really deep spiritual affinity. And as Padmasagara was saying the other night, it's a sort of basic principle in spiritual life that in order to go deep, you have to narrow down. And that's not very popular these days. It's not popular, the idea of it, you shouldn't restrict yourself in any way. But it's just a fact of spiritual life. So the Dharma itself is vast. And it's impossible to practice all the different teachings. And some of them contradict each other in different ways. So what you need to do is you need to find a particular teacher, and it presupposes a particular Dharma, a particular set of teachings that he teaches. And you need to practice that in depth. And through practicing that in depth, paradoxically, you find that you understand all teachings. If you practice one teaching in depth, you come to understand all teachings. If you practice many, many teachings superficially, you get confused. Something to discuss, maybe. Yeah, shortly after Bhante's death, I was watching a video, and it was a video of Bhante on a train in India. I don't know if you've seen it. And he's sitting in a railway carriage, and I think he's got an attendant with him. It might be Paramartha, or I think it's probably Paramartha. And whenever the train stops at a station, there are crowds and crowds of people who want to have contact with Bhante, and they're putting their hands through the window, they're offering garlands, they're offering gifts, they're asking for a blessing. And what you notice watching this video is that Bhante takes in every single one of them, and personally, and responds to them. He accepts their gifts, he takes their garlands, he gives the blessings, and he's responding to each individual. And I've been to India. I've been to India many times. I know in India they regard Bhante as a bodhisattva because he set them free from the slavery of caste. He knows that it's important to these people that they have that contact with him, and he just gives what he is what he needs to be. He just gives what he needs to give, and I've noticed that about Bhante. If you look at pictures of Bhante going back into the past, there are many different Bhantes. There's Bhante in India, who's a bhikkhu. There's Bhante coming to the West, and this sort of in between figure, dressed in robes, but with long hair and long sideburns and lots of rings. And then there's Bhante as the elderly English gentleman, and then there's Bhante as the teacher of the Dalits in India in robes. And he's just being whatever's needed to different people that he's in contact with. And I think that's the mark of a bodhisattva, to be all things to all men and all women as much as possible. So personally, my appreciation of Bhante just grows and grows over the years as my own practice deepens. Okay, so if you're not ordained by Bhante, then nearer still are your preceptors. And I've got a few things to say about preceptors. The public preceptor is probably a more distant figure. It's a more purely spiritual relationship. The public preceptor receives you into the order. You don't choose your public preceptor, but it's still very, very significant. So they have the final say on your readiness for ordination. And it's the public preceptor or public preceptors who accept you into the order. And the thing about the public preceptors is that they hold the trust of the order. And our whole order is based on trust. If you meet an order member anywhere, you trust that they're going for refuge in the same way that you're going for refuge as a fellow order member. So the whole order is based on trust. That's quite incredible, isn't it? And it's the public preceptors that hold that trust. So the public preceptors hold a very significant part in your spiritual life, even though it's a more distant relationship. And loyalty to your public preceptor means being loyal to your ordination and what it represents. And it means particularly being active in the life of the order. It means attending order conventions, national order weekends, taking part in chapters, doing what you can to promote the harmony and unity of the order. And I imagine Surita is going to say more about that. Okay, so the private preceptor, you probably know that the ordination ceremony is in two parts, and the private preceptor the public preceptor represents you being welcomed into the order, the private ordination, the public ordination. The private ordination is to do with your own personal striving, your own personal commitment. And it happens privately, it happens between yourself and your private preceptor. And those two parts of the ordination ceremony, really they're one ceremony, they're equally important. Your private commitment to striving and being welcomed into the order and finding that you're part of something much, much bigger. So loyalty to the private preceptor means being loyal to the bond that's established in the private ordination ceremony. And I think it's good to see keeping up with your private preceptor as a practice, making sure that you write to them, you keep in touch with them, you actually meet them in person. It's not enough just to meet on Zoom. And it's a very important relationship with a private preceptor. And never, ever fall out with your private preceptor. I mean, you might have a few misunderstandings and tiffs, but never fall out to the extent of getting polarised with your private preceptor. And that's the golden rule for a private preceptor as well, never to fall out with men that you've ordained, because if you do, you break up, you disrupt that connection, through the private ordination. So very, very important. And your relationship with your private preceptor will be different. I mean, I've ordained lots of people, and the relationship's quite different with different people. Sometimes it's much more formal, sometimes they're very close friends. It doesn't matter. They're all equally important. So don't worry about your particular relationship with your private preceptor. If you feel it's not too close, it doesn't matter. It can still be very weighty. It will also depend a lot on your temperament and the temperament of your private preceptor. So you don't get chummy with your private preceptor. You're not mates, and you're not sort of entering into a sort of romantic relationship with them. Sort of sentimental relationship. I think the most important thing with the private preceptor is that you choose someone who you respect. And of course, respect can't be demanded. But you choose someone who you feel there's a definite vertical relationship with, who you definitely look up to, and you respect their practice. You respect their efforts to go for refuge. And the private ordination ceremony itself is a very beautiful thing, because you meet with your private preceptor in the ordination kuti, and you're being taken completely seriously. You're having your spiritual practice being taken completely seriously by someone who you deeply respect, and they're affirming that you're going for refuge in exactly the same way that they're going for refuge themselves. So it's a very strong bond there. So as I say, very important to keep up with your private preceptor, not just while you're training for ordination, but after ordination as well. Because you've still got more to learn from them. It's not like passing your driving test, getting ordained. You've still got a lot more to learn from them. They've still got a lot more to pass on. And that relationship will only deepen as you spend more time in the order. And closest of all are Kalyana Mitras. And I'm not going to say anything about the Kalyana Mitras, you can talk about that in the groups. But they're probably people that you have an ongoing relationship with. They might well be people that are at your centre and you spend quite a lot of time with. So just to wind up, at ordination it's very easy to, after ordination it's very easy to forget that our going for refuge is only effective going for refuge. It's not real going for refuge. We're not yet independent of the teacher's dispensation. We don't have substantial, deep insight, I'm assuming. The effectiveness of our going for refuge is dependent upon conditions. And a lot of those conditions come back to other people. And they come back particularly to keeping up our contact with our teachers. Putting ourselves in situations where we're going to be with teachers. And we need teachers, we need Kalyana Mitras who we can turn to for advice, for guidance, who reflect back our ethics and our values and support us through difficult times, who remind us to keep going for refuge. And it's quite interesting because I was on the order, not the order weekend, I was on the weekend just going, the gathering, and there was an order member in my group, and he's had a very, very difficult time in the order, and at times he's felt like leaving the order. It wasn't anything really to do with the order, it's to do with his past really, And he said what brought him back again and again was he realised he couldn't leave the order because of the strength of his connections with his friends and his preceptors. And I think that's very often the case. It's the strength of our connections with our teachers and with our friends that really count, when we're going through a difficult time. And we may go through difficult times. We may well go through difficult times at different times in our spiritual life. It's not a smooth curve, There are quite a lot of ups and downs sometimes. So, there are many fine teachers in Triratna. There's a real body of practice and spiritual maturity and experience, and there are all sorts of different teachers who teach in different ways. Some teach formally through giving talks, through leading retreats. Some teach by example, and some teach just informally through personal contact. And how much we learn from our teachers depends more on our attitude than any deficiency on their part. I think this is very important. So if we're serious about practicing the Dharma, and we're ready and open to learn, and we're living within a spirit of metta and harmony, we will certainly find teachers.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you